I'm walking through the Reformation series that Desiring God put together to give you a fuller history of Christianity. Join me.
John Calvin, just the name itself is huge, right? For a lot of people, he is the Protestant Reformation. He's this towering intellectual figure who completely changed the course of Western history. But what if the story we all think we know isn't the whole story? That's what we're doing today. We're going to peek behind the curtain, behind the legend.
Yeah, this quote really sums up the popular image, doesn't it? A man mastered by the majesty of God. It's powerful stuff. It paints this picture of a guy who is just completely overwhelmed, totally consumed by a vision of God's greatness. A hero, a genius, maybe even a saint of the Reformation.
And look, it is a really powerful and compelling story. I get why it's so popular. But the big question is it the whole picture? Because what you usually find when you start to put these big hero stories under the microscope is something way more complex and, honestly, way more fascinating. All right, so first things first. Let's really break down the story that most people know. This is the popular narrative, the one we could call the hero of the Reformation. So the popular story goes something like this. You've got this brilliant young scholar, John Calvin, who has this sudden, dramatic conversion around 1533. Right after, he builds this entire theology centered on one core idea, the glory of God. Then he goes on to write one of the most influential books ever, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And the story says he kind of reluctantly becomes the pastor in Geneva, almost like he was pushed into it by God. And what was his big mission? To systematize all of Reformation theology and pull this pure, God-centered vision out from the muck of what he saw as Rome's corruption. It's a really clean, powerful story, right? Okay, so that's the popular narrative. Now comes the interesting part. Let's really dig in and see how well that story holds up when we compare it to the actual historical record. How accurate is this heroic version of Calvin? This scorecard is super helpful for breaking it all down. So his biography, the basic life events, the dates, all that stuff, yep, pretty much accurate. The historical record backs it up. But, and this is a big but, look at everything else. His theology, well, it gets boiled down to just one simple phrase, which is a massive oversimplification. The actual context of his rule in Geneva, a lot of the tough stuff gets completely left out. And his influences, this is a huge one. The narrative totally ignores how much he owed to the early church, making him sound way more original than he really was. So let's talk about what this story leaves out, because this is where it gets really interesting. It's in those gaps, in the things we don't usually hear about, that we find the real, flesh and blood, three-dimensional person. Okay, so the heroic version, it doesn't really get into the whole fusion of church and state power. Basically a theocracy where disagreeing with the church could land you in trouble with the law. It kind of glosses over the really severe pastoral discipline, the punishments for heresy, and of course the big one, the execution of Michael Servetus in 1553. And it's not just the political stuff. The simple story misses the theological details too, like how his views on the sacraments were actually way closer to the early church than many people realize. Or how he talked a lot about human responsibility, which makes the whole determinism thing a lot more complicated. And yeah, let's just pause on that word for a second, theocracy. Because this is so important to understand. We're not just talking about a religious leader who has a bit of influence, no. In Calvin's Geneva, your entire life as a citizen was directly tied to being on the right side of the church's doctrine. Your public life and your spiritual life, they were the exact same thing. And the rules were enforced by both the city council and the church leaders. And all this leads us to what is maybe the single biggest piece missing from that heroic story. It's this idea that Calvin just appeared out of nowhere and created his theology from scratch. He absolutely didn't. He was in this deep, ongoing conversation with more than 1,000 years of Christian thinking that came before him. You see, the popular narrative loves to paint Calvin as this total revolutionary who just smashed tradition. But the reality, he was a deep student of tradition. The guy was constantly reading and quoting the early church fathers. Think heavyweights like Augustine and Chrysostom. So much of what we think of as Calvin's theology wasn't a brand new invention at all. It was his reframing of very old ideas. Let's take his biggest idea, the glory of God, as a perfect example. The later Calvinist summary, the one many people know, says man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Okay, now compare that to an early church father, Gregory of Nyssa. He said, the goal of a virtuous life is to become like God as participation in his life. Do you see the difference? One is about showing respect from a distance, while the other is about this deep mystical connection. It's a subtle shift, but it is absolutely profound. So let's just spell it out. What's the real difference here? Well, the later view, the one that became popular, sees glorifying God as obedient reverence. Man stands over here, God stands over there, and man worships. But that earlier, more mystical view from the early church saw it as mystical union. Man glorifies God by actually participating in the divine nature itself. So Calvin didn't invent the concept, not at all. He just shifted the focus away from union and toward obedience. So why? Why is this simpler, heroic story the one that sticks around? And what do we actually learn by, taking it apart like this? Well, it turns out there's kind of a recipe, a formula, for how these heroic stories get built in the first place.
Okay, here's how you do it. Step 1, you create the prophetic intellect. You frame your subject as this reluctant genius who is just so brilliant that they're being compelled by God himself. Step 2, you give them some theocentric heroism. You portray them as the one special person who rediscovered some forgotten central truth. For Calvin, that was the glory of God. And step 3, you use the purification trope. They're not just a reformer, they're a cleanser, purifying a corrupt system. You put those 3 steps together and boom, you've got a simple, powerful, and incredibly memorable story.
And at the end of the day, looking past this heroic narrative isn't about trying to tear someone down. That's not the point at all. It's about getting a more honest, a more accurate, and frankly, a much more interesting picture of the past. We stop looking at one-dimensional saints and start seeing complex, brilliant, and flawed human beings who had a massive impact on the world we still live in today.
And that really leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? Because this whole exercise isn't just about something that happened in the 16th century. We do this all the time. We build these heroic narratives around historical figures, tech entrepreneurs, artists, political leaders, you name it. So the real question to walk away with is this: what hero stories are we telling today? And what crucial, complicated, and important details are we leaving out?